atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav etzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in the words of Torah. Now, as I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone, and if you have anything to say, just unmute yourself and speak away. All right. Now, our lesson today is going to be just basically on one king. Whereas last week we had about 5 of them that we were talking about. Mostly today it's going to be just one king and his grandmother, who was the queen at the time in Judah, and so she was not a very nice person. It's the old saying about when mom ain't happy, ain't nobody happy, and then when if grandma ain't happy, run. Okay, well that's kind of the way it was there in Judah during those days, and so we look at here's the where we are in 2 Kings. We're about here in the middle, and you see this area in here, and then in 2 Chronicles we're way over here at the in this part here. Okay, and again our ubiquitous map of the divided kingdoms. But now here we are on this area right here with Joash, and that's who we're going to be talking about tonight. Totally is Joash. And really, we're not going to be speaking hardly anything at all of anyone over in Israel itself. This is all going to be in Judah. So, all right, beginning with the chapter 11. Now, when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose, destroyed all of the royal offspring. But Jehosheba, daughter of King Joram and sister to Ahaziah, took Joash, son of Ahaziah, and stole him from among the king's sons who were being put to death. She put him and his nurse in the bedroom so that he was hidden from Athaliah, so that he was not killed. He remained with her, hidden in the house of Adonai for 6 years, while Athaliah was reigning over the country. Now, Athaliah, she was the mother of the Judean king Ahaziah, whom you remember Jehu assassinated him, and she was the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, and the sister of the Israelite kings Ahaziah and Joram, who had succeeded Ahab. She was the wife of the Judean king Jehoram. I know that's all confusing, and all those names are very, very similar, but it's just a mess trying to keep those things straight. But her husband had, her husband had died of a intestinal disease. If you remember, we talked about that how a terrible disease that he had of some sort, and various raiding Philistines and others had killed her other sons besides Ahaziah. You see that in 2 Chronicles 21. And so Athaliah proceeded to assassinate all potential successors to the throne, totally disregarding God's will that David's descendants were to rule Judah. You remember in 2 Samuel that's what God had said, that Judah would be ruled by David's descendants forever. And so this, as an offshoot of her trying to assassinate all of these potential successors to the throne, it was an attempt, really just a satanic attempt to exterminate the male offspring, to make the coming one, the promised Messiah, the Savior, the seed of the woman, make that impossible. So, had this succeeded through Athaliah, then in the destruction of the royal seed of David, the promise that was made to David would have been impossible. So, you can kind of see there's several other areas in the Bible where you see that there is just an attempt by the enemy to destroy God's plans, and all of them fail, just as this one ultimately failed. And you have Jehosheba was a daughter of Athaliah's husband, King Joram. Okay, and she may not have been Athaliah's own daughter, probably not, but was a half sister of King Ahaziah of Judah, and the wife of the high priest of Judah. Her mother, and father, that was the king, or she was the half sister of the king of Judah, and his wife, who was the high priest the high priest there at the temple in Judah. So if you got that straight, all right. So anyway, Josephus says that she hid Joash, and it's sometimes written Jehoash, and just she hid him, kind of like Jochebed. Jochebed had hidden Moses, for she did it for only 3 months. Well, Jehosheba hid Joash for 6 years. And what they did was, when she first hid him, she hid him in a room that was used to store spare furniture and mattresses. And so I don't know how Josephus knew that, but there's a lot of things that he said that we just kind of wonder about. Now, and then here it talks about, you'll see a reference to the Karaites. Well, this is another spelling of Karathites. And remember, these were mercenary soldiers from they were actually Philistines, mercenary Philistines who had been fiercely loyal to David and his throne. And so I know it's kind of strange, but these guys had been loyal to David, and then on down through the ages. Remember, this is like 150 years later now. That these Karathites were still serving the king of Judah, and of course they were mercenaries. They were highly paid for that. So anyway, just kind of an aside there. Okay, and so when the high priest crowned Joash, when he was 7 years old, he gave him another little interesting aside. He gave him a copy of the Mosaic Law, and so that's consistent with what the law required. That said that when a man became king, he should write out his own copy of the law. Well, Joash was only 7 at this point, and so possibly could not or had not written out his own copy of the law at that point. Now, this giving of the law is actually the basis for the British custom of presenting any new king or queen of England with a copy of the Bible during the coronation ceremony. So again, there's something that you can play Jeopardy with and just astound your opponents. All right. Any comments or questions? So going ahead, verse 4. Now in the 7th year, Jehoiada, and he's the high priest, sent and fetched the captains of the hundreds of both the Karaites and the guards, and he had them come to the house of Adonai. After he cut a covenant with them and put them under oath in the house of Adonai, he showed them the king's son. All right, so this young man, Joash, had been hidden in the temple for 6 years. Now, how do you hide a boy in the temple for 6 years and nobody noticed? Well, he was probably hiding in plain sight. You remember how that Samuel was raised in the temple? or in the tabernacle actually, and he did things for the priest. He was, he was the, I don't know what all of the things that he did. He was kind of their gopher and their water boy and all of those kind of things. And so we can see that Joash possibly was the same thing. His he was related then, of course, to the high priest Jehoiada, and so he was raised directly under his authority and his mentorship. And so he could have been just, like maybe there were other boys there that were raised in the temple, and people just, well, they didn't really realize who he was, and so he was just another one of the kids that grew up serving the priest, just like some of the other sons of the priests that would have done that. So, and it's kind of funny then that this Jehoiada then at this point, the high priest, had already kind of gone through all of these guards and all of the people there that, the Kerethites and all that, to kind of figure out, okay, where do they stand? Okay. Were they, were they wearing MAGA hats or not? I mean, he had to know whether they were going to be loyal to the office of the king of Judah, the actual Davidic line, or were they going to be loyal to Athaliah? And so once he figured out that most everybody was wanting the king to be of the Davidic line, then his plan could go forward. Now, Matthew Henry, the I don't know, who Matthew Henry is. He's a commentator from Bible scholar and so forth from, I don't know, 1800s. He pointed out that Jehosheba, the wife of Jehoiada, was a daughter of King Joram and a sister of Ahaziah, and that actually she had a better right to the throne of Judah than Athaliah did, because her bloodlines, and Athaliah was just married into the family, but Jehosheba was actually born into the Davidic line. And so it is kind of an interesting question as to why Athaliah did not attempt to murder her. And the fact that she was the wife of the high priest may have had some kind of may have been the reason for that. She was kind of protected in that way. All right, so let's go ahead then. In verse 5, then he commanded them, saying, "This is what you will do. 1/3 of you, those going on duty on Shabbat, keeps watch over the palace. Then another third will be stationed at the sewer gate, and the last third will be at the gate behind the guards. So you will keep watch over the house on every side. Your other 2 divisions, who are off duty on Shabbat, will also keep watch over the house of Adonai for the king. So you are to surround the king on every side, every man with his weapons in his hand. Whoever breaks through the ranks must be put to death. You must be with the king in his comings and goings." All right, so these were the rulers over hundreds. The priests and the Levites, and one of the things that I read said that this would have been 1,000 people there who were on guard. And so why did he do this on a Shabbat? Well, that's because there's a couple of reasons, and one of them was that they had the changing of the guard on Shabbat. So the priests, remember, they in the times of David, he had divided the priesthood into 24 courses, and they served in the temple for a week at a time, and then they changed over at when the Sabbath began. And remember, that's when they changed out the showbread and many other things. And so the idea that with all of these priests and Levites and everybody coming together on Shabbat morning, or Shabbat actually Friday evening, and then Saturday, the actual day of Shabbat, then there would have been about 1,000 of these guys, and by someone's estimation, about 1,000 in both groups of priests, the ongoing and the offgoing, plus the Karaites. But it would have been just like every other week, where there's 1,000 of them coming together, one of them going off duty, the other one's coming on duty. And so it would not have raised any suspicions at all for 1,000 of these guys to be there on this particular day. And these guys knew that this was a serious business. Anytime you're trying to pull off a coup attempt, then that it had to be done properly, and it was a deadly thing. So these people had been, Jehoiada had certainly vetted all of these people. He knew that they were going to be loyal, and they had actually cut a covenant with them. So this cutting of a covenant was very important to these people. And so the Kohen, going to verse 10 there, the Kohen delivered to the captains of hundreds the spear and shields that belonged to King David, that were in the house of Adonai. So the guards stood, every man with his weapons in his hand, from the right side of the house to the left side of the house, by the altar and the house, around the king on every side. Then he brought out the king's son, put the crown and the insignia on him, and so they proclaimed him king and anointed him. Then they clapped their hands and shouted, "Long live the king." Now this would have been quite the scene, I would imagine. So the Levites and the priests, they're coming in to do their priestly duties and things, which meant, doing sacrifices of the animals and taking out the ashes, and those priestly things that they did. They would not have been armed at all. I mean, the only thing they may have been armed with was, the knife that they used for the ritual slaughter of the animals. Probably not a real good, and those would have been obsidian or flint knives, rather than a big sword or something. So Jehoiada opened up the armory of David that was stored in the temple. They still had David's all of the arms that he had, and so I just find that incredible that they still had these shields, and they had the swords and the spears and all that. And so they armed all these guys with these antique weapons. Here they are, 200 years old, and they've got the spear out here, and I mean the shield out here, and maybe a spear or a sword. And those were the same ones that David had put in there 200 years ago. So that would be that'd be kind of cool. And fortunately, a 200-year-old sword that had been stored properly, and a 200-year-old shield would probably still be okay. Maybe the leather bindings on the shield might have been a little bit stiff, but it would not be like us going back and going into an armory of weapons from 200 years ago, and finding that we got to use flintlocks against AR-15s. That would not have been a real good fight. But anyway, these things, for them to go in there and have these weapons. Maybe they were antique. They might have been bronze swords rather than iron swords, steel swords. But at the same time, it was enough to fulfill God's purposes there. So this young Joash was raised in the temple by the high priest. He was anointed. He was crowned king of Judah. He was given a copy of the Torah. The people were obviously pleased with the arrangement, and began to shout and clap their hands and blow trumpets, and it was just a big joyous occasion. And so it was they raised quite a lot of noise in this whole thing. So, any comments or questions yet so far? Okay. So when Athaliah heard the noise of the guards and the people, she came to the people in the house of Adonai. She looked, and behold, the king was standing by the pillar, as was the custom, with the captains and the trumpets beside the king, and all the people of the land rejoicing and blowing trumpets. Then Athaliah tore her clothes and cried, "Treason, treason." Well, okay. This crowd, this must have been a pretty good sized crowd when they uh, for her to hear all of that, depending on your view of where the temple was. Those of you that believe that the temple was up on the where the Dome of the Rock is right now, up on the Temple Mount area, uh, that would have been a pretty good hike down from the city of David up to there, and several hundred yards. And those of you that believe that the temple was actually right there at the much closer to the northern end of the city of David, and not actually on the Temple Mount, it would have been a shorter route, and the noise would have reached her a little bit better. But either way, the Bible says that she heard the this cacophony that was coming from the temple, and so she went up there to see what was going on, and finding out that people are cheering, and they're blowing trumpets, and it was just, she had to know at that point that her time was short, and so. She went up there, she saw all of that, and so here she had cried out that, "Oh, this is treason," and evidently the crowd believed otherwise, and so they weren't buying it. So then Jehoiada the Kohen ordered the captains of hundreds appointed over the army, and said to them, "Bring her out between the ranks. Whoever follows her, put him to death with the sword." For the Kohen said, "Let her not be put to death in the house of Adonai." So they laid hands on her, they arrested her, and brought her to the horses' entry of the royal palace, where she was put to death. So she was actually dragged out of the temple grounds, the actual temple grounds, brought to the basically the rear entrance, the horses' entrance of the royal palace, where she lived, and there she was executed. We don't know how she was executed. We know that was she stoned? We don't know. But the high priest did not want bloodshed on the temple grounds, not human bloodshed. So he ordered that she be brought outside before she was executed. Now, if you'll remember that when Stephen the martyr he was being accused by the Sanhedrin, they dragged him out of the temple area before they stoned him. Same thing with Paul the apostle, Rav Shaul. They dragged him outside the temple area, and they stoned Paul. But they quit, thinking that he was dead. But then a little bit later on, he got up from uh, being stoned, and went and started preaching the gospel again. So, um, they just that was a very important thing, that they didn't kill a person inside the temple. So, um, going ahead, then Jehoiada cut a covenant between Adonai and the king and the people, that they would be Adonai's people, and also between the king and the people. Next, all the people of the land went to the temple of Baal, tore it down. They broke his altars and his images into pieces thoroughly, and slew Matan, the priest of Baal, before the altars. Moreover, the Kohen appointed officers over the house of Adonai. Then he took the captains over hundreds, the Karites, the guard, and all the people of the land, and they brought the king down from the house of Adonai and came by the way of the gate of the guards to the royal palace. So he sat on the royal throne. Then all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet. They had already slain Athaliah with the sword in the royal palace. Okay, so cutting a covenant, what does that mean? You remember that in the days of Abraham, God cut a covenant with Abraham. And what he did was they killed animals, they cut them in half, they split them, they just right down the backbones, cut them in half. And then the two parties generally in a covenant, when you cut a covenant, that's why it says it's cut the covenant, you'd walk between these animals. And depending on the, whether these are kings or what, there might have been a lot of animals there. And the two parties of the covenant would have walked between them, between these dead animals that were split in two. And the thought process behind that was that when you go through these animals, may I be like one of these animals over here if I should ever break this covenant. And so that's what they did. And it said that he cut a covenant between Adonai, because he was the high priest, he could do that, and the king. And so they would have split these animals, and Jehoiada, as the high priest, the representative of Adonai, he would have walked between these animals with the king, which was Joash, the 7-year-old young man who is now the king. They would have walked between those and looked at each other, and they may have actually said a blessing or something that or an oath that said, may we be like these animals here, dead and cut apart, if we should ever break our covenant with each other. And then they did they cut a covenant between the king and the people. Now, what would they have actually done? What would the covenant have been? Well, it would have been more like the I would say maybe something like the Magna Carta, where it was listed out that the king would follow the rules that God had laid down before them. There were definite rules and rules of behavior that God had set before the people as to how a king was to conduct himself. And for instance, a king was not supposed to have a whole bunch of wives and a whole bunch of horses, which many of the kings they violated that. They ignored that. And look at Solomon, supposedly the wisest guy in the world, and here he had 1,000 wives and concubines and all that kind of stuff. Well, it's hard enough to keep one woman happy, but trying to keep 1,000 of them happy, oh man, alive. And so God had a plan. He had a good reason. Said don't do a lot of that. Don't have a whole bunch of horses. Why? Because then when these kings would have a bunch of horses, they'd have a bunch of chariots, and then they would decide, hey, I can go to war and I can beat anybody. Whereas God had a plan. As he had a territorial design for Israel, and that did not include world domination. So he told them those were some of the things that God had told the kings, and they were also to respect the people. And the foreigners would be treated properly, and slaves would be treated properly, and all of these different things were expected of a good king, a good godly king. And so now they were going back to that and just outlining it. Okay, now Joash, you are going to be the king, and these are the things that God expects of you. And so again, Joash would walk through that valley of dead animals, and then representatives of the people would, some of their judges and some of their leaders and so forth would also walk with them as representatives of the people, and they would have this covenant cut between the two of them. All right. So that was, and they probably, I guess they did that right there on the temple grounds where they had cut these animals, and bloodshed of animals within the temple grounds was okay. Bloodshed of humans was not. All right. So that ends chapter 11. Now, are there any comments or questions so far on what we've covered?
Hello.
Yo.
I have a kind of more of a general question.
Okay.
About the next 5 minutes. We often come across this tearing of clothes or tearing of robes in our readings, and I'm not always sure when I read that. Obviously, it's something negative. It's out of despair or anger or sadness, and the nuances do make a difference sometimes in the reading. And so, first of all, am I correct that it's usually like despair or sadness or anger? And how do I determine the nuances when I'm reading?
Okay, when these people of the of that era would tear their clothes. Now you got to remember that clothing was a very, very expensive commodity. If you remember that a lot of times, like when Naaman came from Syria to be healed by Elisha, that he brought with him like 10 changes of clothing, along with bunches of gold and silver. But they would actually, then they said, he brought along with him this number of wardrobes that they would have. And so that would have been very, very expensive. Most people of the day, they may have only had like one real set of clothing that they had. And so having the clothing, workers, men would, in many cases, they would work almost, depending on what they were doing and where they would work naked or almost naked so as not to destroy their clothing. And so the idea of coming up and tearing your clothes was a form of letting people know the mental state and the mental agony that you're going through at this particular time. No matter what it may be. It could be grief over the loss of someone. It could be anger over something that someone had done, and it could be just about any great, overwhelming human emotion that you would have. And this was a way of expressing it, that here I am destroying something that's very valuable to me, and everyone is going to be able to see it. Kings would do that so that people would know that, okay, the king is not happy right now, and so stay away from him. Or in some cases we read that where the king we tore his shirt or tore his outer cloak open, and they saw that he was wearing sackcloth underneath, so he was doubly upset over these things. So sometimes it was, he had already put on his sackcloth, so and then he was tearing the clothes. So that was something that would have been contrived. It was staged, as it were. But in this case with Athaliah, I'm sure that she got there, and that was just the deal that, okay, if she tears her clothes, and however they would do it, I don't know what they would do and how much they would do it. Maybe they only tore a few inches of their clothing, but it was always recognized as a demonstration of human anguish as to what was going on, what was taking place with them at that time. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's a great explanation. Yeah, it does. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so let's see. Let's go ahead. Any other comments or questions before we go into chapter 12? Okay, so in chapter 12, Joash was 7 years old when he became king, and Joash began his reign in the seventh year of Jehu, and he reigned 40 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zibiah of Beersheba. Now Joash did what was right in Adonai's eyes all his days, just as Jehoiada the Kohen instructed him. Okay, now you got to look at this very carefully here, because if you read the English translation of it, you get the idea that Joash did everything that was right in Adonai's eyes, for until he died, until the day he died, he was doing exactly what God wanted him to do. No, he did what was right in Adonai's eyes, as long as Jehoiada, the high priest, was instructing him and was alive. Okay, so that's what, when you get into the Hebrew, that's the little nuance there, that that Joash was a godly man, and he did everything that he was supposed to, as long as his mentor, the high priest, was still alive. So now, um, this had been, I figured out, looking at some of the genealogies and the times and so forth and so on that we have here. Um, it's going to be about 150 years since the death of Solomon. Okay, and actually 150 years since the temple was completed. So just keep that in mind, because that becomes pertinent in a minute. So it says in said, going ahead in verse 4. Now here I also mentioned that Joash's mother's name was mentioned, probably to establish a genealogical distance between him and anything that could be associated with Athaliah, who was also part. She was not part of Judah's bloodline, of David's bloodline. She was actually the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, and so that made her completely different blood stock. And so this Joash's mother's name was probably in a way just establishing with everybody, says, hey, he doesn't have any of that bad blood from Ahab and Jezebel in him through his grandmother Athaliah, because she was not actually a blood relative of his. So going ahead, if I can get my things right. Okay, here we go. The high places, however, were not taken away. So Joash did everything he was supposed to do, as long as Jehoiada was the high priest, but the high places were not taken away. The people were still sacrificing and burning incense on the high places. All right, this is one of those things that I look at and I say, these high places were very, very popular. Okay, now I've told you about um, um, up in here's one at Tel Gezer, is one of these high places that they talk about, where people would go, and you can still see the standing stones there today. And here's one I talked to you about up in Tel Dan. Now what they have, last time when I was there, they didn't have this cardboard thing here of the altar. They have a metallic, just a metal thing that's a representative of the altar, and you can and it has the horns of the altar here, and these are the steps of the little palace that they or temple that they had built up there at Tel Dan. And I think what they've done is they've added this stuff since I was there. because they were still trying to get. When I was there, they were still trying to work on the foundations of all that stuff. And of course, the tree that is growing there, that tree was not there 3,500 years ago. It just has grown up, and I don't know if they're going to cut it down or not, but probably not, because trees are a valuable commodity in Israel, and they try very hard not to cut a tree down. But these were high places. This was where the northern king there, he he was the one that he established this temple as an alternative to the worship in Jerusalem. Okay, so basically it turned out to be just another high place where people could go and sacrifice and burn incense, and with the intent, or with the thought that through that, okay, I am appeasing Adonai, I'm appeasing this god or that god, or whatever. But the people had been burning, they had been doing sacrifices and burning incense at these high places for centuries before the Israelites got there. So it was ingrained into the population. And of course, so much of the pagan population had assimilated into Israel at that by that time, that these were just kind of second nature to them, that people would accept that as that's just the way, we do things these days. And it's like some of the things that happen in our world today, that if you look at it, you'll say, no, that the Bible really is against that. But yeah, I know, but that's just the kind of the way we do things nowadays. And it's, yeah, God really doesn't care about that, and I mean, even shoot, it's not even a real baby until it's born, and even then, I mean, that's just the way it is. That's what I'm talking about, when people just accept something like that, and of course, should you not understand me there, I am not saying that uh, that abortion is acceptable by any stretch of the imagination. It is not. It's an abomination, and people will actually, um, those that keep. I saw one woman said that she had had 21 abortions. Well, that just means that she's a serial killer in my mind. But those kinds of things. A lot of times we just let it ride, let it go, and because we get complacent, and I think that's how these high places were. They'd grown complacent with it, and they just accepted it. But to God, He still wanted those things torn down. All right. So, comments, questions on that, on the high places. And some of those high places are actually pretty picturesque. They get up there on those things and look out over the landscape. And I can see why they would do that, because it's just kind of a cool place to be anyway. So, all right, then Joash said to the Kohanim, the priest, all the money of the sacred donations brought to the house of Adonai, the money in exchange for each person's valuation, which was the temple tax, as well as all the money that anyone's heart prompts him to bring to the house of Adonai, let the Kohanim receive it, each from one of the treasurers, so that they may repair the damage to the house wherever any damage is found. But by the 23rd year of King Joash, the Kohanim still had not repaired the damage to the house. Okay, that is typical of government, isn't it? They say they're going to fix this and fix that and all that kind of stuff, and it never gets fixed. All we do is get politicians reelected, and so the priests were pretty much the same kind of thing. There's three kinds of money that they're talking about here. Okay, there is the half shekel required by the law that everybody had to pay, that temple tax. There's the money paid by those who devote themselves when they make like a Nazarite vow or something like that, and then that can be variable depending on the age, the gender, and what property it is that they're doing. And then the other was money that was offered as a as a free will offering, just something like that. We would say it's not required. It's not my tithe. I just want to give to something. I just want to give an offering to the Lord. And people still will do that today. I'm sure many of you, as well as I, have done that, given an offering for some purpose. All right. Now, we're looking at the temple here. It's about 145 years old at this point, and it had fallen into disrepair. Well, there's times where stuff happens, and you'll have a maybe a stone or a capital or something that breaks off for one reason or another, and it needs to be repaired. Well, it's not repaired. And then we find out that Athaliah had been using materials from the temple to build and upgrade her temple to Baal. And so basically, the God's temple was in pretty poor repair. So Joash says, "Hey, let's fix this up." Well, after 23 years, nothing was still done. And so then Joash summoned Jehoiada, and Jehoiada the Kohen, his mentor there, and the other Kohanim, and he said, "Why are you not repairing the damage to the house? Now, therefore, take no more money from your treasures, but hand it over for the damage to the house." The Kohanim agreed that they would take no more money from the people, nor would they repair the damage of the nor would they repair the damage of the house. But Jehoiada the Kohen took a chest, bored a hole in its lid, placed it up beside the altar on the right side as one entered the house of Adonai. The priestly guards of the threshold deposited there all the money that was brought into the house of Adonai. So basically what has happened here is you see that the priests, the priesthood, the Levites they had been in charge of all of this stuff, and they were not really doing what they should be doing. And so the government steps in, Joash, and said, "Okay, you don't take the money from anybody else anymore. We're going to take the money. We're going to take over. We're going to supervise this money. We, being the king, the executive, are going to take this money and supervise in getting all of it. And then we will divvy the money out, and we will take care of this, because you guys haven't done it in 145 years. And certainly these last 23 years after I told you to do it, you still haven't done it. So I'm going to take over and do it." Well, that sounds good, but at the end of things, that's not the way God had set it up. And so it's you'll find out later, it doesn't work that well. And whenever you have the government coming in and taking over what God should be doing and what we should be doing for God, then you've got a mess on your hands. All right, so we don't know why this stuff was not being taken care of. A lot of people say, well, it's because the money just came in and they gave it to the priest, because typically I would imagine the people, the priest didn't have an inheritance, and so the money that did come in, maybe it wasn't really adequate to do all of the things that they wanted to do, and then feed the priests and take care of them. We don't know. So could it have been incompetence, or was it corruption? We don't know. The Bible doesn't say. It just wasn't taken care of. Okay. Now, we see that now Joash says, "Okay, you're going to bring all this money in. Also, we're going to go out into the land, into wherever anyone is, throughout the land. We're going to tell them, all right, guys, it's income tax day. You got to pay your taxes to the temple, and take this. And not only that, we're wanting to, we got this building fund set up now for the temple, and we want to repair it. So if you would like, let's contribute money to the repair of the temple." Well, guess what? When people were made known, when they were made aware of the problem, they made out, they gave their money, they paid their taxes and their temple tax, and then their vow taxes, the money that they had to give for their vows, all the things that were specified in Torah that they should be paying for, they started doing it. And so then they had a lot of money. And so from then, it things started to turn around as far as the temple. And so whenever they saw that there was a large amount of money in the chest, the royal scribe and the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, would come up and put the money in bags, count it out. They would account for all of the money, and then they would give it over to the people who were overseeing the house of Adonai. They in turn would pay it out for the carpenters and the builders who worked on the house of Adonai, the temple, and the masons and the stone cutters and the timber cutters and the stone cutters and the all of the things that needed to be done. And it was, to lay out for the house and to repair it. But there were no silver cups, snuffers, bowls, trumpets, and no vessels of gold or silver made for the house of Adonai, for the money brought to the house of Adonai. For they gave it to those who did the work, and with it they repaired the house of Adonai. So what they're saying here is that all right, no, they didn't buy any. They didn't say, okay, yeah, we're gonna do this this building fund here, and fix, so that we can fix these columns or fix that wall and the plasters and so forth and so on, and then take the money and go and buy trinkets and gold and all of the fancy things. No, they didn't do that. And that specifically said that the money went to pay the workers to do the building. And it said, and they even said in verse 16 then that I know I didn't put it in the outline. I'm on a rabbi trail now. They didn't check on the men to give to whom they gave the money to pay the workers, for they dealt faithfully. They were so confident that the people that they had lined out to do this work were doing the job that they were supposed to do. They didn't even account for them. They would give the money to the foreman, and then the foreman would divvy it up, and evidently the work was going very, very well. So then some of the money that did come in for like a guilt offering and money from the sin offerings, those were not brought into the house of Adonai to build, the house of Adonai. That was actually built that was given for the maintenance of the Kohanim, like it was supposed to be done. But they did get enough money. They were rebuilding the temple, and the money still was coming in. So now they could do what needed to be done for the priest. And that is so much like in real life, where God says, test me, if I don't open up the windows of heaven, you bless the kingdom of God, and he's just going to bless you. You pay your tithes and offerings, God will bless you. And I guarantee you can live better off of the 90% than you can live off of the 100%. All right. Now we got to go, because that started to preaching. So we need to get going there. All right. Then in verse 18, then King Hazael of Aram marched and attacked Gat and captured it. And next Hazael set his face to march against Jerusalem. But King Joash of Judah took all the sacred objects that his fathers, Jehoshaphat, Joram, and Ahaziah, kings of Judah, had dedicated, and his own sacred objects, and all the gold that was found in the treasuries of the house of Adonai and the royal palace, and sent them to King Hazael of Aram. So he withdrew from Jerusalem. Can you imagine a guy that supposedly had been, he had been doing right in God's eyes all these years, until, I mean, now it's almost the end of the time, almost 40 years now. And so this guy attacks him, only reference to anyone attacking him. And so what does he do? He shakes in his boots and he says, and he gives away the farm. He gives away everything in the temple and his own treasury to Aram. If he'll just go to Hazael of Aram, if you'll just leave us alone. Well, Joash did not consult God. He didn't say, hey, do we need to go out here and take care of this guy? Or, you know, are you going to be with us if we go take care of this guy? No, he didn't do anything. He just, you know, just decided, okay, we're just going to give it all up. And so he depleted the entire royal treasury, the entire temple treasury, everything, so that that Hazael would go away. And so, as it turned out, you know, just the next year or so, uh, Hazael attacked him again, and he had nothing to pay him off with. And so they did mount an attack against Hazael, and he, even though he had a much smaller army, God was with him instead of with the king of Judah, and he caused the king of Judah to lose terribly. And so King Hazael of Aram went through in God's judgment, basically is what it was, and he just devastated the kingdom of Judah and took everything else from everyone else. And so you read about that then in Second Chronicles. We're going to jump from Second Kings over to Second Chronicles for a second. Now, after the death of Jehoiada, the chiefs of Judah came and bowed down to the king. Then the king listened to them, bad counsel, and they forsook the house of Adonai, the God of their fathers, and served the Asherah poles and the idols. Wrath came upon Judah and Jerusalem for their guilt. Adonai sent prophets to them and brought them back to him, and though they admonished him, they would not listen. When the Ruach Elohim came upon Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, the Kohen, this is the son of the high priest now, he stood above the people and said to them, thus says God, why do you transgress the mitzvot of Adonai? You will not succeed. Because you have forsaken Adonai, he has also forsaken you. But they conspired against him, and by order of the king, they stoned him to death in the courtyard of the house of Adonai. I mean, they're again not supposed to shed blood in the temple area, and yet they stoned the son of the high priest. Well, guess what? That might have made the I don't know if Zechariah was now the high priest after his father had died, but if they went and they stoned him in the courtyard of the house of Adonai, they're shedding blood, human blood, on the temple grounds. So big no-no. So thus King Joash disregarded the loyalty which his father Jehoiada had shown to him and slew Jehoiada's son. As he was dying, he said, may Adonai see and avenge. So then it came to pass that the turn of the year, the Aramean army came up against him. They invaded Judah and Jerusalem and massacred all the chieftains of the people, sent all of their plunder to the king of Damascus. Although the Aramean army came with only a small number of men, Adonai gave over a much larger army into their hands because they had forsaken Adonai, God of their fathers. So they executed judgment upon Joash when they withdrew from him, for they left him very, very sick. His own servants plotted against him because of the blood of the sons of Jehoiada, the Kohen, and assassinated him on his bed. He died and was buried in the city of David, but not in the tombs of the kings. Okay, he was not given the honor of being buried with the kings. Why? Because he had led these people astray. So, you know, this was all Joash's own fault, you know, and his staff murdered him, and he was held in such low regard by the end of his tenure as the king that he was not buried with his ancestors. And so with that, we will leave off, and next week we will begin then with Amaziah, the next king. Okay. Any comments or questions so far? Well, so far, this is the end of it. So do you have any comments or questions on any of this? Okay, I can see I just wore you all down. All right. Then in that case, then I'm going to go ahead and, as you know, what we always do, I'm going to stop the recordings, and then we can have more of an informal chat if you wish to do that.